The W116. It all started in 1972. In September of that year, Mercedes-Benz premiered their new S-Class, the W116. It came into being during a time when fuel prices were soaring, and emission regulations were becoming stricter, particularly in North America. Big engines in big cars were soon considered a social crime, and a trend developed toward smaller cars with smaller engines. W116 was a big step for Mercedes, for it would lead a revolution that was to affect all Mercedes cars coming after it. The name S-Class had the honor of premiering in the W116, and, from then on, the top-of-the-line Mercedes sedan would be known as an S-Class. The W116 brought forth a new styling era for Mercedes. Contrary to its predecessor, W108, the W116 featured a design statement that was to become synonymous with Mercedes' styling, conservatism. Indeed, the design was very unadventurous, with Mercedes aiming for a car that could merge into the flow of traffic without attracting too much attention. This was exactly what some people wanted, a car not too ostentatious but, at the same time, having a mildly upscale elegance to it. The front of the W116 featured a central wider grille compared to the previous narrow grilles so favored by the Swabians. The long rectangular lights were to become a Mercedes styling cue until the mid-1990s. Careful attention was paid to front aerodynamics, which can be seen in the slanted and shaped underside body under the front bumpers. At the rear, Mercedes introduced longer rectangular lights, which like the front lights, were to become a styling cue of the company for latter models. In spite of these revisions, the car was not exactly a stunner, but customers of the era liked it, and it sold well. The W116 started the white letters on black background with an orange needle speedometer tradition, which lasted until the early 21st century. Many people saw the interior as a step backward because of the use of dull plastic and the lack of chrome. The previous W109 possessed an interior that was filled with chrome, and had fewer plastics, giving it a certain old-world charm. No, Mercedes was not cost-cutting. Back then, Mercedes-Benz did not care at all about production costs since they could sell every car they made. The magic word was, once again, conservatism. The new direction Mercedes was taking, as mentioned earlier, was to take effect on all models following the W116. It is no wonder that the Mercedes of the 1980s and early 1990s had essentially the same exterior and interior style. Boxy, yet elegant, on the outside. And high-quality plastic with wood in the interior. W116's interior did, however, feature something completely new and advanced for the period. Safety. The dashboard and steering wheel were heavily padded, and were deformable in case of impact. Perhaps one of the W116's strongest points was its safety. The W116 was the first Mercedes to feature safety-oriented thinking in the design of the car. This means that crucial and easily damageable parts of the car were relocated to positions on the body where there was a relative safety from damage in most accidents. The fuel tank, for example, was positioned above the rear axles. Previously, Mercedes fuel tanks were located at the rear of the car, where they were vulnerable to rear-end crashes. The doors of the W116 were also strengthened with door pillars and tougher steel. There was also an enhanced roof frame should a W116 be involved in an accident where it could flip on its roof. The car also received anti-lock brakes as a good measure, but this occurred later on in the W116's lifetime. More? The rain gutters on the front of the windshield were designed to reduce the amount of water flowing over the screen. This may have appeared to be a trivial detail but proved to be a help in the end for safe driving. It was such little details that enhanced Mercedes' reputation for building safety-oriented cars. The rear lights of the W116 featured a ribbed design, which apart from fitting the car, have been proven to reduce the dirt that could accumulate on the rear lights in bad weather driving. Seems trivial, Mercedes didn't think so. Technologically, the W116 was also a very advanced car for its time period. The front suspension, for instance, featured double wishbones and coil springs, not to mention the super advanced self-leveling system of the 450cc 6.9. At the rear, the suspension was modified to give the car more predictable handling by giving it a semi-trailing arm arrangement. This replaced the previous Mercedes swimming arm rear axle, which reached critical levels when the car was driven with extreme vigor. The suspension setup also provided a great deal of comfort, something that this car was designed and intended to offer. Handling was good for its time, but these days, a W116 will be more of a disappointment. The steering is vague and lacks the precise feeling that most of us are used to. Thank the traditional Mercedes recirculating ball steering system for that. Mind you, it handles fine if driven slow and in limousine style, but sporty driving was never the W116's strength, and there is a lot of body roll in corners when driven hard. Even the mighty 450cc 6.9, which could dust various sports cars of the period and came closest to the ideal of great handling, does not leave much of a positive impression on you these days. Back then, the conduct of the W116 was considered impressive enough and owners did not complain. The body roll, too, was the mark of a heavy car. On the positive side, though, the W116 earned points for its solid and tank-like build quality. In fact, the heavy weight often gave it an unfair advantage in accidents. Internally, the W116 along with the R107 SL were known as Der Panzerwagen, a testimony to their superb build characteristic. As mentioned earlier, the design of the car was safety-oriented and, indeed, the W116 was one of the safest cars to travel in during this time. In case you are wondering, all W116s came with power steering as standard. Lower-end Mercedes, usually in Europe, did not have this useful feature unless you paid off price. American spec Mercedes have always enjoyed more useful standard equipment than European spec Benzes. In terms of engines, the W116 came with a somewhat small lineup of motors, starting with the base 280S and ending with the infamous 450cc 6.9. There was also a diesel W116 in the form of the 300ST turbo diesel. However, the diesel W116 was only sold in North America, not Europe or elsewhere. Unlike modern S-classes, the W116 had a very small target market, which did not call for offering more varied engine options to widen the appeal of the car. Mercedes knew exactly what type of people an S-Class appealed to in those days, and planned out the range accordingly. 280C, 280cell. The E in 280C/cell stood for Einspritzung, and hinted at the car's use of a fuel-injected engine, a luxury in 1970s Europe, as mentioned previously. The 280C models were a more expensive and powerful alternative to the lethargic 280S models, and so the 280C/cell wins the award for being the most popular W116 with a total of 150,983 280s and 7,032 280 cells being sold in its 8-year production run. It is interesting to note that most of the cell models were sold as fleet cars to businesses, while the 280C was sought by private buyers willing to spend a little more for power and speed. The 280cell models also proved hugely popular with German government officials as well as in some Asian markets. Yet the 280C was merely an incremental improvement over the 280S. Employing the same engine, but with fuel injection and an OHC design, a 280C/cell managed 185 horsepower and 238 Nm of torque, doing the 0 to 62 miles per hour sprint in 10.5 seconds, top speed only increased by 10 km per hour to a final mark of 200 km per hour, miles per hour. Nonetheless, minor differences like these meant a lot in this period, and many people gladly paid the DM 25,530 for a 280 say. The 280 cell cost DM 31,698, a 200 horsepower V8 350 say cost DM 28,860. Some people really do buy their cars for that extra legroom in the rear. Fuel injection did little to quench the thirst of the 280 cell, with the model returning similar fuel economy as the 280S. But for many, it was the livelier and more rev-happy fuel-injected engine that was well worth the money over the 280S. Fuel injection was something to brag about in 1970s Germany. In early 1976, the 280 say models received a Bosch K-Jetronic fuel injection system. The reason behind this was partly due to the change from leaded gasoline to unleaded gasoline in Germany, but mainly because of new emission laws in Europe. The standard E-Jetronic system worked well with leaded fuel, but was nothing but trouble when having to deal with unleaded gas. Performance suffered and fuel economy worsened. Sadly, the K-Jetronic killed off 8 horses for a final total of 177 horsepower. Intriguingly, 2 years later in 1978, Mercedes was able to refine the K-Jetronic fuel injection to produce the necessary 185 horsepower which the 280S so needed. Both the 280S and the 280 say models were produced at the same time, starting in August 1972 and ending in July 1980. The 280 cell models first appeared in October 1973, and production ended 2 months before the 280S and 280 say models were discontinued. 350 say, 350 cell. With the 350 models, the real fun began. Customers at this level were quite serious about prestige and power. The 350s proved to be better suited for a mix of both power and cruising, being smoother and more refined than their smaller 6-cylinder brothers. It can be said that the 350 models were aimed at sporty drivers because of the powerful engine and the standard 4-speed manual transmission, which worked better in enthusiastic driving than the optional 3-speed automatic. However, Mercedes was cursed with not being able to produce a decent manual transmission. The 4-speed stick shift may have offered more fun, but some of that fun quickly disappeared since the transmission was so clunky. It lacked smoothness and precision, and was not even worth comparing to other manual transmissions of the period. The 350 models featured a 3.5-litre V8 engine that started at 200 horsepower. As was the case with the 280 models, the V8 engine had seen duty in the previous W116 280 say 3.5/280 cell 3.5S class. The engine performed best at higher RPMs, especially with the manual transmission, and the 350 say could achieve a sub-10 seconds 0 to 62 miles per hour time. The expensive automatic transmission actually outsold manual 350s, with more customers being interested in relaxed driving and cruising. The 3-speed automatic used a hydraulic clutch, and was available in floor or column shift position. For the period, it was considered an excellent transmission. By today's standards, it may seem a little slow. 350 consumption was rated at 13 liters/100 kilometers, but this figure is a little too optimistic and unrealistic. 450 say, 450 cell. The 450s enjoyed flagship status for some time before the mighty 6.9 came along. It was easily one of the best sellers in the W116 range, especially in cell form, thanks to its alluring interior space and excellent un-Mercedes-like value for money trait. That's right. Value for money. Compared to their competitors, the 450s were well equipped and more appealing overall. Automatic transmission was standard for one, and the 450s offered superb comfort because of a modified rear suspension which also had the side benefit of remaining stable during high speeds or kickdowns. Occupants felt little of these antics. By now, this level of comfort was a Mercedes trademark. It was only available with that 3-speed automatic transmission which did quite well managing and using the power of the engine. The 450s were by no means blisteringly fast, but offered a high standard of luxury for their time. The 225 horsepower, 4,520cc V8 engine was a simple OHC design with 2 valves operating per cylinder. The same engine was also serving in the R117 SL Roadsters and C107 SLC coupes. Buyers enjoyed the rev-happy and responsive qualities of the engine rather than the performance factor. 450s became slower when they received the Bosch K-Jetronic fuel injection system, but that did not deter buyers. Indeed, despite the oil crisis, it sold surprisingly well. The 450 cell even won the Car of the Year award in 1973, at a time when big engines and big cars were frowned upon. Things would get even worse, with the model that was to be the pinnacle of the W116 range, the almighty 450 cell 6.9. 450 cell 6.9. Mention the W116 to most people who know a little about cars, and the most likely response will be 450 cell 6.9. Once the choice of Sterling Moss, it is indeed perhaps the most famous W116 S-Class, credited with fielding the largest production engine ever put into a Mercedes car. Until the R129 SL73 AMG came along in the mid-1990s. The 450 cell 6.9 was the top of the line W116, signifying power and prestige in one package. Due to the oil crisis of 1973 to 1974, the introduction of this top-notch W116 was delayed until May 1975. From the very beginning, it was a very limited production model whose high price was a second statement that this car was going to be bought by those with wealth. On the 6.9, goodies such as an RPM gauge, electric windows for both front and rear passengers, and air conditioning were standard. No need to pay extra in this case. Unlike other W116s, the 450 cell 6.9 could not be defined as Spartan. Rear leather seats were an option, interestingly enough. The engine came from the previous top-of-the-line S-Class, the W109 300 cell 6.3, and was bought out amongst other modifications. This motor was one of Mercedes' most famous engines, having its origins in the infamous W100 Mercedes 600 Pullman. Despite the 6.9 badging, the engine capacity was closer to 6.8 litres. Horsepower was rated at 286 and torque was an immense, which meant explosive power and acceleration. Despite these figures, the 450 cell 6.9 lacked the instantaneous acceleration of its forebearer, the 300 cell 6.3. At fault was the heavy weight of the car, which was further burdened with the installation of safety devices, something that had been absent in the 300 cell 6.3. Incidentally, US spec 6.9s were slower than Euro spec version. Due to the US crash regulations of the time, W116s destined for North America were fitted with energy-absorbing bumpers that were long and heavy. These obviously added weight, and worsened handling considerably. Mercedes had the nerve to claim a fuel consumption of 16 litres per 100 kilometers, 14.6 miles per gallon. Contemporary testers never bested this claim. 6.9s were notorious gas guzzlers, and figures between 20 to 25 litres per 100 kilometers are more realistic. For spirited drivers, the fuel mileage became drastically worse, forcing owners to stop often and refuel the 96-litre fuel tank. In spite of not being as quick as its predecessor, the 6.9 had a reputation as a sports car killer, meaning that it could give many a sports car of its day a run for their money. The sheer torque of the 450cc 6.9 enabled it to enjoy quick mid-range acceleration sprints, and reach its then impressive top speed of 225 km per hour. Again, consider that some sports cars of the day could not even attain such speeds. A kickdown in a 450cc 6.9s called on the enormous torque reserves of this car, causing it to veer slightly sideways and forcing the driver to correct constantly with the steering wheel. It was not that serious, but the 6.9 had a tendency to, shall we say, go its own way when pressed hard. Couple this to the vague, recirculating ball steering system, and you had a car that has tremendous power, but could not really exploit it. Nonetheless, the 6.9 remains a superb automobile even in this day and age, and is the highlight of the W116 range. It was produced only in LWB form, with a very small number of RHD cars made. 300SD Turbo Diesel. The 300SD was exclusively produced for the North American market, where it proved to be a huge success with 28,634 models reaching American soil despite a prohibitive price tag of $25,000. Corporate average fuel economy. Laws of the United States had called for automakers to reduce their fuel consumption to a fleet average of 27.5 miles per gallon. The 300SD made history as being the first mass-produced turbodiesel sedan in the world, and was the first higher-end Mercedes destined for export with a turbocharged oil burner up front. Diesel engines in luxury cars were a Mercedes specialty. The Swabians had experience with this concept for decades in Europe, and now it was time to give the North American market some insight into what a diesel could do. The benefits of low-end torque and fuel economy were particularly stressed in period advertisements that were designed to generate interest in the car. The 4-speed automatic transmission was tuned for a high-end top speed. Itself academic in the US, the diesel W116 topped out at 165 km per hour, or 103 miles per hour, quite a feat for a diesel back then. Such a speed could have been useful in Europe, but not in the United States. The turbocharged diesel engine came from the W123 300D turbo diesel. It was good for 115 horsepower and 231 Nm of torque at an early 2,400 RPM. From these numbers, it is easy to see that the 300SD turbo diesel was never going to break speed records. Then again, this car was made for cruising with fuel-conscious buyers in mind, and that, the 300SD did extremely well. Obviously, the diesel's advantage was fuel economy, and that, the 300SD turbo diesel delivered. On average, the 300SD could achieve ratings between an optimistic 8 liters per 100 kilometers, and a more realistic 14 liters per 100 kilometers. Not bad. Not bad, considering that the diesel W116 weighed a hefty 1,815 kilograms. That is around 29.3 and 16.7 miles per gallon respectively. US spec W116s looked very different from what the Europeans and the rest of the world were used to. The United States had a rule about bumpers withstanding impacts of up to 8 miles per hour. Accordingly, Mercedes lengthened and strengthened the front and rear bumpers of W116s going for export to North America. These bumpers not only made the W116 heavier, but affected handling, and as a result, American spec W116s were the poorer cousins of their European counterparts. To make matters worse, there was also the issue of sealed beam lights, required on all cars in the United States. That, in case you were wondering, explains why American spec W116s had those unattractive, small round lights up front. The fact that the 300SD was only made for the US market does not mean it was the only W116 offered in North America. The 450 cell 6.9 was eagerly awaited by the power-hungry Americans, and it made it over the Atlantic. The 450 cell was also sold in the US for a while. Obviously, North America did not care about the 280s, and they were never even considered for export to North America. However, the Americans were cutting back on their smog habits, and US spec W116s received horrific power cutbacks. To give you some idea of the difference, a US spec 450 cell could be outpaced quite easily by a European spec 350 cell. The Europeans enforced some of their own emissions laws, of course, but not as drastically as did the Americans.